Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Boston, Massachusetts. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. Let's begin. The year was 1892, a season of mist and reform. Boston's narrow streets echoed with the sound of carriage wheels over wet cobblestone, and beneath that rhythm lingered a quieter unease, the sort that kept curtains half-drawn and doors locked at sundown. In the South End, an unremarkable brick clinic stood between two shuttered bakeries, its small brass plaque reading, Dr. Edward Thorne, Surgeon. At first glance, Dr. Thorne seemed every bit the gentleman physician, educated, punctual, and unfailingly polite. His neighbors described him as measured and grave, with eyes that seemed forever weighing one's words. Yet within months of his arrival, small whispers began. A maid who left his employ without collecting wages, patients seen entering after hours, never again by daylight. City records show Thorne had leased the property from a retired apothecary named Gideon Marks, whose own ledger, preserved in part by the Historical Society, mentioned subterranean alterations to the foundation, commissioned by the new tenant. At the time, such renovations attracted little notice. Boston's medical quarter was expanding, and basement cold rooms were commonplace for specimen storage. But as autumn deepened, police blotters began to note curious disappearances, laborers, a widow, a visiting salesman from Lowell. Their names appeared briefly in the Boston Evening Transcript, soon forgotten amid election talk and maritime news. Only one detail tied them together. Each was last reported near the corner of Rutland and Tremont, the very street of Dr. Thorne's modest practice. Comparisons were later drawn, quietly, in academic journals, to the case of Herman Webster Mudgett, better known through later accounts as H. H. Holmes. Though Holmes operated largely in Chicago, his methods, the professional disguise, the elaborate false walls, the calm civility concealing predation, were unsettlingly familiar. Historians still debate whether Thorne ever met or corresponded with Holmes. No proof exists, but both men studied at Eastern medical schools within a decade of one another. One neighbor, Mrs. Alma Pritchard, would testify years later that the doctor's windows glowed long past midnight, and a faint humming, like a saw muffled by cloth carried through the floorboards. She had assumed it surgical work until, one morning, she noticed fresh earth piled beside the rear steps. "I thought it drainage," she said, until the smell came. When municipal inspectors finally visited the property in early 1893, Dr. Thorne was gone. The clinic stood locked, its rooms neat and bare. Only the basement betrayed disturbance, a section of flooring pried up and replaced with mismatched boards. Beneath them, according to constable notes later archived at City Hall, lay evidence inconsistent with lawful medical practice. No charges were ever filed. The physician vanished as quietly as he'd come, leaving behind only an invoice ledger, a handful of surgical implements, and a city suddenly unwilling to speak his name aloud. The police report from January 1893 was concise, almost cold in its phrasing. Premises vacated, evidence retained for review. Nothing further was ever added. The cellar was sealed, and the building itself sold twice over the next decade, each new owner claiming ignorance of its previous tenant. A local archivist, Samuel Denby, found mention of the case while cataloguing municipal correspondences in 1901. He described the original inspection notes as disturbingly incomplete, yet what survived was grim enough. Measurements of a narrow crawl space, 3 by 8 feet, lined in lime and packed earth. There were fragments of fabric, a shoe buckle, and what one officer called an irregular femur, likely human. Dr. Thorne's name never appeared again in the city registry after December of 1892. His diploma, recorded at the Massachusetts Medical College, confirmed legitimate training, though later cross-referencing with alumni lists revealed inconsistencies in his place of birth and early employment. Several letters, later recovered from an abandoned trunk in a boarding house, were signed simply E.T. and bore the return address of Providence, Rhode Island, though handwriting experts of the time could not confirm they belonged to the same man. The Boston medical community remained publicly silent. Only in private correspondence did his colleagues acknowledge the whispers. One surgeon, Dr. Alaric Morrow, wrote in a letter to a colleague in 1894, "It is unwise to speak of Thorne, though I cannot erase the recollection of his experiments with preservation. He was forever fascinated with the threshold between vitality and decay." It was this very obsession that some historians later compared to the macabre curiosities of H. Holmes, whose own case was still under investigation in Chicago around the same time. Newspapers drew parallels in style and opportunity, suggesting both men exploited trust within the growing medical profession. The Boston Herald ran a column in 1896 speculating that perhaps Dr. Thorne's works were an Eastern rehearsal of Holmes's greater design. What little we know of the doctor's final weeks comes from an errand boy named Caleb Finnegan, who claimed to have delivered parcels to the clinic shortly before its closure. In a sworn statement, he said, "The doctor paid with silver coin but never looked up. His sleeves were rolled, his hands blackened with soot, and a foul vapor clung to the stairwell. Neighbors soon reported a lingering dampness seeping through the cellar floor into the adjoining bakery, described as a mildew that smelled of sickness. The Board of Health briefly considered condemning the building, but deferred after an inspector fell ill during examination, an incident that fueled further gossip. A single newspaper, the Boston Courier, attempted to revive the case in 1902, publishing excerpts from Denby's findings. The story was swiftly retracted within the week, citing incomplete verification of sources, yet copies of the withdrawn issue circulated quietly among historians and collectors for decades. Even now, fragments of Thorne's ledger remain housed in the city archives, itemized lists of preparations, donors, and preservations, written in neat clinical script. Nowhere does the doctor confess, but the tone of precision, of careful, emotionless record-keeping reveals more than any direct admission could. By the turn of spring in 1893, the once bustling block along Rutland Street had grown quiet. The clinic stood empty, its windows boarded, the brass plaque removed. Children dared each other to touch the door after dusk, whispering that the doctor's eyes still watched from the cellar. Local rumor turned the property into a living ghost, one the city preferred to forget. In 1895, a property broker named Silas Beckett purchased the building at auction, hoping to convert it into rental rooms for dock workers. His renovation crew worked only 2 days before abandoning the site. In his affidavit, Beckett recounted that the men unearthed something akin to a ledger box filled with residue and bone dust beneath the northeast corner. He delivered it to a constable, who dismissed it as old anatomical waste and returned it unopened. Beckett sealed the basement and never returned. The name Thorne surfaced again in Providence around late 1896, this time connected to a Dr. Edward Thornell, who had leased a small apothecary shop near Weybosset Street. Contemporary directories list him briefly, before erasing the entry the following year. Those few who recalled him later described a reserved gentleman with foreign manners and a faint surgical scar running along the temple. One elderly resident, Mrs. Clara Dunn, remembered, "He always wore gloves. Even in July heat, never once did I see his bare hands." Around this same period, the case of H. Holmes in Chicago reached public attention through sensational newspaper coverage. Historians writing decades later, such as Dr. Morton Hale of Harvard, referenced Holmes's notoriety to frame similar, smaller disappearances along the eastern seaboard, cases like Thorne's that never found formal closure. Hale wrote, "If Holmes built his castle of deception in steel and flame, Thorne buried his in mortar and silence." The comparisons served not to conflate them, but to underline how the age itself allowed such men to vanish behind the veneer of professionalism. A parish record from Boston's St. Matthias Church notes a curious entry dated April 1897. Donation of medical volumes. Unclaimed estate of Dr. E. Thorne. The books, mostly on human anatomy and preservation techniques, were said to emit a faint odor of formalin. When examined by Father Merriweather, he remarked in the church journal, "Some pages stuck together with a substance unknown. I burned them in the yard rather than store them among sacred texts." The building itself was eventually condemned following a small fire in 1900. The blaze, attributed to a lightning strike, destroyed the upper floors but left the stone cellar largely intact. Firemen reported charred beams fused with the ground as if by design. Afterward, no developer expressed interest in rebuilding. The lot remained vacant for nearly 2 decades, fenced and overgrown. Those who lived nearby continued to speak of odd sensations, of a hum underfoot when standing near the old foundation, of a faint metallic scent when the wind turned east. The district's children grew up believing the cellar still breathed beneath the earth. A story passed from family to family as both warning and entertainment. Even today, some archived municipal maps mark the property simply as medical lot unreclaimed, a bureaucratic way of saying what locals already knew, that Boston preferred its ghosts buried, not exorcised. The city's silence did not last forever. By 1903, urban renewal projects reached the South End, and surveyors returned to document the derelict parcels. Among them was a young draftsman named Henry Alcott, whose journal later became a minor curiosity among historians. Alcott wrote, "The lot on Rutland bears an air of quiet disease. Even the grass refuses to rise evenly, as though the soil remembers what men prefer to forget." His sketches, preserved in the Boston Public Library's archives, reveal something peculiar, a faint depression in the ground precisely where Thorne's basement once lay, bordered by warped stonework and the remnants of a drain. Alcott's supervisor ordered the site filled, citing safety, but the young man confessed he felt a movement beneath the soil, a slow shifting that made his boots tremble. The entry ends abruptly with a note. Workmen refused to continue after dusk. Around this same period, a retired police constable named Jonathan Cleary published a small memoir recounting his years in the Boston force. One chapter, quickly suppressed from later editions, mentioned a doctor of the South End, whose property inspection produced findings never meant for the eye of man. Cleary wrote that the official report was redrafted twice, the original sealed in the municipal vault under public sanitation. He hinted that the disappearance of this report coincided with the political career of Alderman Partridge, who had briefly campaigned on cleaning the city's lower wards. The resurfacing of Thorne's name reignited whispers among older residents. A reporter for the Boston Gazette, Elias Crane, attempted to trace surviving witnesses. In an article draft found posthumously in his effects, Crane noted, "Of all who once lived near the clinic, few remain. Those who do regard the subject with dread, as though the man himself may yet be listening from beneath the boards." Crane referenced his research alongside the now infamous Chicago case of H. Holmes, observing how public fascination with hidden chambers had grown into a sort of national Gothic. He cautioned readers that Boston's own ghosts were quieter, but no less methodical, perhaps a nod to Thorne's clinical precision. The parallels he drew were not sensational but forensic, comparing newspaper phrasing, police terminology, and even similarities in how city officials handled the press. By 1905, new structures surrounded the empty lot, yet none encroached upon it. Builders described sudden equipment failures and unexplained dampness that corroded tools overnight. The ground itself seemed resistant, swallowing posts and stone as though rejecting intrusion. One carpenter, Levi Hart, told a labor inspector, "You could dig a trench at dawn and find it half closed by dusk." Locals began leaving offerings, small coins, flowers or folded notes near the fence, a habit neither wholly superstitious nor devout. Some claimed it kept misfortune away. Others said it honored the forgotten. When an evening wind crossed Tremont Street, it carried with it a faint echo, metallic, hollow, and low. It might have been nothing more than the shifting of buried pipes, yet many swore it sounded like the measured rhythm of a surgeon sharpening his instruments, still preparing, long after his name had vanished from every ledger. In 1906, nearly 14 years after Dr. Thorne's disappearance, a brief letter arrived at the office of the Boston Medical Review. It bore no return address, only the initials E.T. pressed into red sealing wax. Inside was a single sheet of aged stationery, inscribed in steady, practiced handwriting. "To those who questioned my methods, I sought preservation, not destruction. What you call death is but an imperfect pause." The editor, Dr. Lionel Grafton, dismissed it as an imitation or morbid prank. Yet the stationery watermark matched a Providence supplier that had closed in 1897, a curious detail that reignited speculation among the review's younger physicians. The letter was quietly filed away, never published, But decades later, it resurfaced in the archives of the Massachusetts Historical Society. Its authenticity still debated. Meanwhile, the lot on Rutland Street drew another kind of visitor. Spiritualist movements were flourishing across New England, and Boston was no exception. In 1908, a small séance circle led by Madame Lucinda Vere, a self-proclaimed medium from Salem, conducted sessions near the fence surrounding the old clinic site. Her notes, preserved by an assistant, described a presence bound by tools of healing turned to torment. She claimed the spirit gave its name as Edward, though it refused to confess or leave. The city's newspapers mocked her account, but curious crowds began gathering after nightfall, leaving candles that guttered in the sea breeze. That same year, a municipal ledger recorded a property tax payment made in arrears by proxy for the abandoned lot, the payer listed only as representative for medical estate. The handwriting once again bore a resemblance to Thorne's. Investigators found no trace of the representative or their address. Historians later compared this odd pattern of reappearances to the elusive habits of figures like H. Holmes, who, according to contemporaneous reports, had similarly maintained aliases and correspondences after his supposed arrest. Whether Thorne drew inspiration from such methods, or both men simply mirrored the age's chaotic professional record-keeping, the similarity reinforced the period's uneasy boundary between legitimacy and deceit. In 1909, excavation for a new sewer line along the adjacent street unearthed fragments of stained glass and iron hooks, items catalogued but never claimed. An engineer named Thomas Kell noted that the smell of chemical preservative rose from the ground, even after decades of rain. It was as if the earth remembered the surgeon's hand, he wrote in his field diary. Later donated to the Boston University archives. That year, storms flooded much of the South End. Locals claimed that when water pooled in the sunken lot, the surface shimmered strangely, reflecting not the grey sky above but something darker, almost metallic. Children told stories of seeing faces ripple in the puddle, though adults dismissed it as the tricks of light and a grim imagination inherited from their parents. The city fenced off the property again, this time citing unstable foundation soil. It would remain untouched for years, a pocket of rot within the growing metropolis, a reminder that some places never consent to be buried. By 1910, Boston's modernization swept through the South End like a second birth. Electric street lamps burned where gaslight once flickered, and the rattle of new trolleys drowned most of the city's old whispers. Yet the fenced-off patch at Rutland and Tremont still stood untouched, a small scar among the new brick facades. Property assessors avoided it, clerks misfiled it, and tenants across the street quietly crossed themselves when walking home at night. A city engineer, Robert Hensley, was assigned to resurvey the area for drainage improvements. His field report dated June 3, 1910, describes the ground as saturated with preservative oil, odor persistent, though no visible contamination. He added a final line in pencil. Feels as though something breathes beneath. The file was marked incomplete and never revisited. That same summer, a traveling medical lecturer named Dr. Warren Hale delivered a public talk at the Massachusetts Medical Society on anomalous surgical ethics of the late 19th century. His presentation referenced several cases, including that of a Boston surgeon who abandoned his practice amid grave irregularities. Scholars later identified this as the first academic mention of Edward Thorne since his disappearance. Hale carefully avoided speculation, but cited parallels to the then recently exposed crimes of H. Holmes in Chicago, noting both as symptoms of an age wherein progress outran conscience. His words revived fleeting curiosity, and for a brief time, the press sniffed again at the forgotten story. An article in the Boston Post from August 1910 reopened the matter, interviewing descendants of Thorne's former landlord. One of them, Eleanor Marks, recalled being told as a child that the cellar was sealed not by order of law, but by the church. She described a priest sprinkling holy water around the doorframe, muttering Latin phrases before instructing her family never to rent the property again. The church denied any such ritual, yet the account endured. Weeks after the article's release, Hensley, the same engineer who had surveyed the ground, was found drowned in the Charles River. No foul play was proven, but among his possessions was a folded map of the South End, with the old clinic circled in red ink. His wife, interviewed briefly, said he had been restless, muttering in his sleep about footsteps under stone. City officials, uneasy with the renewed attention, removed the fence and filled the lot with gravel, officially designating it as a temporary utility yard. But the workmen complained of their tools corroding faster than use could explain, and by autumn the yard had been abandoned again. Old residents claimed the earth exhaled on warm nights, a slow, damp breath that carried the scent of iodine and rust. Perhaps it was only the tide rising through buried drains. Perhaps it was memory itself seeping back through the cracks of the city. By 1911, only those who remembered the original scandal still spoke of it, and even they did so in low tones. The doctor's name was no longer written in municipal records, but in Boston's whispered folklore, Thorne lived on, as the surgeon who refused to let his work rest beneath the floor. The final chapter of the public record concerning Dr. Edward Thorne unfolded quietly in 1912, though few recognized it as such at the time. The city had planned to extend a new tram line through the South End, and the project required regrading several neglected streets, including Rutland. Crews arrived in early May, their machines clattering, against soil that hadn't been disturbed for over a decade. Foreman John Elwood later testified that the first day of excavation went without issue until the second afternoon, when a shovel struck something metallic beneath a foot of compacted clay. Expecting an old pipe, the workers pried it loose, revealing what one described as a flattened case, blackened by oil and sealed at the edges. When Elwood forced it open, a dense chemical odor poured forth, making two men retch. Inside lay surgical instruments, scalpels, clamps, a stethoscope, each wrapped in oilcloth and etched faintly with initials, E.T. The discovery made brief news before being overshadowed by larger national stories. Only a single column in the Boston Evening Transcript mentioned it, noting that medical tools of indeterminate origin were recovered from the site of a long-condemned clinic. No official inquiry followed. The items were logged by the Department of Sanitation and stored in a municipal warehouse, where they vanished sometime before inventory review in 1915. Archivist Samuel Denby, now an aging man, returned to his earlier fascination with the case. He petitioned the Historical Society to reopen their investigation into Thorne, arguing that the discovery of the tools suggested a deliberate burial, not abandonment. His letters, preserved in the Society's correspondence files, contain a chilling line. If the surgeon meant his work to rest, why preserve it so carefully from decay? Around that same year, Denby cited the Chicago Tribune's retrospectives on H. Holmes, noting the eerie resemblance between Holmes's construction of secret chambers and Thorne's sealed foundations. Both men, he argued, reflected a peculiar scientific pride born of the 19th century's untempered faith in progress. While Holmes's tale concluded with a hanging and confession, Thorne's absence turned him into something less definable, a rumor, a curse, a lingering idea of intellect corrupted. In June 1912, surveyors filling the old trench noticed the soil settling unevenly again. One described a hollow collapse like something underneath giving way. Rain that week flooded the depression, leaving behind a shallow pool. Children who played nearby claimed to see shapes beneath the surface, not reflections but forms, as if the cellar itself was still there, breathing under the mud. By autumn, the tram project rerouted around the property altogether. The blueprints show a curious bend in the line, officially marked as unfit ground. The detour still exists today, a minor kink in an otherwise straight course. Urban planners never corrected it, though few know the reason why. The neighborhood moved on, yet a faint unease clung to the air. Old residents insisted that if you walked that stretch of Tremont Street after rain, you could smell ether and hear the faint tick of metal on stone, the ghostly cadence of a surgeon still at work beneath a city that never dared to exhume his truth. By 1913, the South End had shed much of its former gloom, replaced by new housing and the low hum of electric streetcars. Yet that one peculiar bend near Rutland Street remained, a silent reminder of the land's uneasy past. The city's surveyor maps, redrawn that year, labeled the area as Stabilization Zone C, a bureaucratic term that quietly ensured no structure would ever again rise upon that patch of earth. A generation removed from the first discovery, younger residents treated the story of Dr. Edward Thorne as myth, an urban ghost tale whispered at boarding houses and taverns. But in certain academic circles, the case retained a colder fascination. Professor Lionel Keene of Harvard's Department of Forensic Studies delivered a private lecture that same spring titled Medical Ethics in the Age of Dissection. Though he did not name Thorne outright, he referenced an unnamed Boston practitioner whose cellar revealed remnants of experimentation unfit for daylight. Keene cited the earlier case of H. Holmes, noting that such figures reflected the unchecked arrogance of science in the twilight between discovery and depravity. His words, though measured, revived curiosity among medical students who began seeking out fragments of the original police notes. One such student, Clara Winslow, found herself drawn to the mystery. In her later memoir, she described visiting the archives in 1914, where she located a sealed envelope labeled South End Clinic Matter, 1893. Inside were 3 photographs, poorly preserved, their edges curling with age. 2 depicted the clinic's interior, a simple examination room and a narrow stair descending to the cellar. The third showed a section of floorboards lifted aside, revealing a pit lined with limestone and surgical tools, half buried in soil. Winslow wrote that she felt a sudden chill, as though someone stood just behind my shoulder. She left the archives before closing time and never returned. In August of that same year, construction crews laying cables nearby reported an odd occurrence. Their instruments registered a consistent electrical disturbance whenever placed near the old lot. Supervisors dismissed it as faulty grounding, yet one technician, Edwin Caro, later swore in a letter that he heard a faint rhythmic tapping under the gravel. The sound, he said, repeated like breath, steady, measured, unhurried. City Hall received multiple complaints that autumn about a chemical vapor drifting from storm drains along Tremont. Health inspectors traced it to runoff pooling beneath the old foundation stones. Samples taken from the water showed traces of formaldehyde and mercury chloride, preservatives long outdated but consistent with those used in late 19th century surgical practice. Officials recorded the finding without further inquiry, choosing to reseal the drains rather than disturb the soil again. Among Boston's aging residents, these reports rekindled the old whispers. "The doctor's work isn't done," one elderly woman told a reporter for the Evening Globe. "He's still down there, keeping them whole." The quote never made it to print, struck from the editor's draft for fear of ridicule. But the original note survives in the Globe's microfilm archives, a last echo of unease written in trembling pencil. By winter's end, snowfall covered the empty lot once more, smoothing its contours as if erasing memory. Yet beneath that white hush, the ground still held the faint pulse of a story Boston would never entirely silence. By 1914, the Great War had begun to pull attention away from local mysteries, and Boston's newspapers filled their pages with dispatches from Europe rather than rumors from the South End. Yet, in the quiet corners of the city archives, a handful of scholars and clerks continued to revisit the files labeled Clinic Case, 1893. Among them was archivist Helen Dorr, a meticulous researcher with an interest in urban legends that overlapped with public records. Her correspondence to a colleague that year included an unsettling observation. The handwriting in Thorne's old ledger, compared to the letter signed E.T. found in 1906, shows not only consistency but improvement, as if the author had aged forward in grace, not decline. Dorr believed someone, perhaps Thorne himself or an imitator, had maintained a quiet presence through anonymous donations and minor clerical interventions. Several municipal receipts from 1908-1912 bore the same peculiar ink mixture, a blend of violet and black favored by doctors for its resistance to fading. These documents, though mundane, shared a single recurring annotation at the margin. Maintained. In the spring of 1915, the Harbor Gazette printed a brief article describing a chemical seepage incident near Tremont Street. Workmen digging for water mains reportedly uncovered jars filled with cloudy liquid. Each jar contained what officials later described as animal specimens preserved in a concentrated solution. The jars were carted away by the city's sanitation bureau, yet rumors spread that the contents were not animal remains at all. An anonymous worker told a reporter, "Those were no beasts. One of them looked to have a hand." The discovery rekindled comparisons to H. Holmes, whose trial transcripts had recently been reprinted for sensational interest. Writers in Boston's literary clubs began revisiting Thorne's story as a local moral allegory, using his disappearance as metaphor for the perils of unchecked intellect. The Beacon Review ran a piece titled "The Surgeons," Silence, describing Thorne as a phantom born of medicine's shadow. The article cited City, records lost to reform fires, echoing the fate of many Boston documents destroyed in periodic municipal clearings. During that same summer, an aging Professor Keene revisited the case in a lecture at the Lowell Institute. He argued that Thorne represented a unique moral pathology, the physician who saw the body not as sacred, but as clay, a material for experiment. His remarks drew small crowds, and though he never named Holmes, the connection was clear. Both, he said, sought mastery over decay, mistaking control for salvation. Later that year, Dorr made one final note in her file before retiring. Visited the lot again. Gravel has sunk 2 inches since last winter. Air carries faint odor of alcohol and iron. No trace of plants. She sealed her papers and marked them unresolved. No new construction followed. By Christmas 1915, snow once more buried the uneven ground, and the city's pace quickened under wartime urgency. Only the old remained to remember that beneath that stretch of Tremont Street, something unspoken had once stirred, and perhaps, in some quiet manner, still did. In 1916, the empty lot on Rutland and Tremont found itself once again at the center of whispered fascination. The war had thinned the city's workforce, and municipal inspectors reassigned from military factories began reviewing neglected urban parcels. Among them was Inspector Franklin Rowe, a quiet, deliberate man with a taste for precision. His written memorandum, discovered years later in a bound volume of Municipal Property Surveys, provides one of the last first-hand accounts tied directly to the Thorne. Cite Rowe described his initial visit on June 11, 1916, noting that the ground remained unstable, though visually dry. His team dug shallow test holes to measure drainage, but within minutes the air filled with a pungent odor of ether and damp ash. A laborer collapsed after inhaling the fumes, and Rowe ordered the area cleared. His report ends with a single unsettling sentence. Audible disturbance persisted beneath the trench for several minutes after cessation of work. Steady rhythm, 6 per minute. No follow-up investigation occurred. The city simply closed the file, stamping it non-hazardous vapor emission. But Rowe's private diary, later found by his grandson in the 1940s, contained an additional entry dated the same day. Not sound of machinery. Closer to breath. I counted. Steady like pulse. The discovery of that note decades later would inspire renewed public interest in Thorne's legend, though at the time the entry remained private. Meanwhile, as Boston's population swelled with new immigrants, old quarters were demolished for broader streets and tenement expansions. Yet somehow the Thorne parcel escaped every redesign. The official explanation cited subsurface instability, but locals joked that the city engineers simply feared what else might be buried there. Night watchmen claimed the air near the site grew warmer after sundown, and stray animals avoided the fence line entirely. A few of Rowe's colleagues mocked his report, calling it superstitious fancy, but others remembered earlier archives, letters from archivist Helen Dorr and surveyor Henry Alcott, both of whom had noted similar sensations of shifting soil decades apart. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Still, with the country soon to enter war, no one had patience for spectral stories. In November 1916, a fire at the municipal warehouse destroyed several decades of property ledgers, including the original documents cataloguing Thorne's surgical instruments recovered in 1912. Some said the fire began from a chemical explosion. Others whispered it was deliberate, a final cleansing of the doctor's trace. Only fragments of records survived, their ink bubbled and blackened, unreadable except for one repeated word near the margin: preserved. That same winter, a blizzard buried Boston in white silence. Photographs from the period show the south end cloaked under snowdrifts high as door frames, the old lot reduced to a featureless mound. But even then, one detail persists in eyewitness notes: steam rising faintly through the frost where no pipe or vent existed. Some thought it warmth escaping from the earth. Others said it was the ground's slow exhale, Dr. Thorne's final patient, the city itself, still under his careful eternal observation. By 1917, the United States edged closer to war, and Boston, buzzing with enlistment drives and factory expansions, seemed determined to forget its ghosts. Yet one lingering administrative question returned to the City Council: what to do with the Stabilization Zone C parcel still registered under the defunct name of Edward Thorne. MD and auditor flagged the discrepancy, noting unpaid taxes stretching back 25 years. The land technically belonged to no one, yet every attempt to reassign ownership ended abruptly when files went missing or signatures smudged before drying. That spring, the Board of Assessors ordered a new survey. The task fell to Clerk Andrew Mallory, a conscientious young man unfamiliar with the site's history. His first field report began pragmatically, but grew strangely personal. The soil looks like it's been turned recently, though records suggest no activity for years. There's a low hum when the wind passes, the kind you feel in your chest, not your ears. Mallory returned twice more before abruptly requesting reassignment. Co-workers recalled him pale and trembling, muttering about a handprint in the dust where no one had walked. Within weeks, he left the department entirely. His supervisor, finding his unfinished drafts, filed them without comment. At the same time, Boston's medical schools had begun re-examining the ethical boundaries of their early practices. Professor Lionel Keene's death in February spurred renewed discussion of forgotten cases, including his unpublished paper on Thorne. In a memorial piece, the Journal of New England Medicine reflected on men of science who lost their compass in pursuit of perfection, citing parallels. Between Thorne and Chicago's H. Holmes, the comparison was brief but telling. It anchored Thorne's myth in historical discourse rather than superstition. Meanwhile, parish records from St. Matthias Church note that a visiting priest performed a blessing of troubled ground near Rutland Street that April. Though the reason was omitted, local parishioners claimed a faint tremor rippled through the earth during the rite. The priest, a newcomer from Halifax, refused further comment but described the sensation in his travel diary. It was as if the city itself recoiled, like flesh under a cold instrument. Shortly afterward, the council's Land Usage Committee voted unanimously to convert the area into a paved inspection yard for trolley maintenance. The work began in late May under heavy rain. Within a week, equipment broke repeatedly, belts snapping, lamps shorting, and one steamroller sinking nearly half a foot into perfectly dry gravel. The foreman blamed poor foundations, but one mechanic swore he heard a hollow knock beneath the roller before it gave way, as though striking a buried door. By summer's end, the project was quietly abandoned. A thin layer of asphalt covered the lot, and no further entries appear in municipal ledgers for over a decade. The name E. Thorne was finally struck from the register, replaced with a coded property number that even clerks forgot to update. Still, night guards working along Tremont claimed the asphalt stayed warm long after sunset, never freezing, never truly cooling, like something alive beneath, pulsing faintly through the stone. The winter of 1918 brought with it two unseen plagues, war's shadow and the influenza sweeping through Boston's crowded quarters. The city grew quieter, fearful, its streets emptied by curfews and the smell of disinfectant. In that silence, old ground seemed to stir again. Residents along Rutland and Tremont began reporting strange fogs drifting low over the pavement, curling like breath from a wound. One night watchman Arthur Meeks logged the incident in his patrol notebook. Haze rising from the asphalt near the old yard. No smoke, no flame. Smells of ether and salt. Lasted 20 minutes, then gone. Authorities blamed ruptured chemical drums from nearby supply depots, but Meeks's report predated those shipments by several days. The note vanished from official logs soon after. By March, the epidemic had claimed hundreds across the district. Temporary infirmaries filled the schools and churches, and among the exhausted medical volunteers was Nurse Clara Winslow, the same woman who years earlier had glimpsed the old photographs of Thorne's cellar. In her personal diary, recovered decades later, she wrote, "These fevers come fast, burning the lungs. The smell in the wards is the same as that night in the archives, the same sharpness of alcohol and iron. I dream of the pit again. I think the city remembers. Hospitals overflowed and makeshift morgues lined the river. To keep up, crews dug trenches near the outskirts, their work illuminated by lantern light and the muffled toll of church bells. Rumors spread that one of those temporary graves had been dug close to the old clinic ground, and that when the first spade struck soil, it met not earth but wood. Workers claimed they uncovered a section of plank, perfectly preserved, with hinges rusted shut. The foreman, unwilling to delay, ordered it covered. That same month, a maintenance worker for the Boston Elevated Railway recorded that heat continued to rise inexplicably beneath the unused trolley yard. He wrote, "No fires, yet frost melts here first. Smells like medicine, like a bottle uncorked." When he reported the anomaly, the supervisor simply told him to mark the area stable. By summer's end, the influenza's grip loosened, and the living began counting their dead. City records show that the South End lost more than any other district. Among the names, C. Winslow, cause listed as pneumonia secondary infection. Her diary closed with a final entry dated October 3rd. He waits below. The air is waking again. After the epidemic, the lot returned to anonymity, paved and forgotten beneath the weight of rebuilding. Yet when winter frost came, steam still rose faintly from that patch, curling in the lantern glow like the memory of something once sterile, once human, refusing entirely to rest. Newspaper boys running late routes called it the doctor's breath. They laughed when they said it, but none ever paused their step when passing that place, not even to tie a loose shoelace. By 1919, the war had ended, and Boston's noise returned. The clatter of trams, the ringing of church bells, and the shuffle of men finding new work. Yet the corner of Rutland and Tremont remained curiously unclaimed, its paved surface cracked and sunken in a single circular depression. The city called it a drainage failure, but locals whispered otherwise. That spring, a group of engineering students from MIT conducted soil experiments across the South End for a study on urban subsidence. Their team, led by James Pell, drove a core sample drill directly into the center of the depression. Pell's field notes, preserved in the Institute's archives, record an odd occurrence. At depth of roughly 12 feet, instrument struck cavity. Audible metallic resonance, brief suction of air. Core extracted damp, discolored, reeking of formalin. Lower samples returned temperature 4 degrees warmer than ambient soil. The team's supervising professor dismissed the results as contamination from industrial runoff. Yet Pell's private letter to a classmate painted a stranger picture. The earth was warm, almost alive. When I sealed the sample jar, the glass fogged from within, as though breathing. Not long after, another disturbance shook the district, the great Boston molasses flood of January 1919. When the wave of syrup tore through the North End, newspapers filled with gruesome images of suffocation and ruin. Some South End residents claimed that in the weeks following, the smell of sweetness mixed unnervingly with that old medicinal scent rising from Rutland Street, as though the city's wounds were bleeding together. The disaster rekindled interest in Boston's older unsolved horrors. The Herald ran a retrospective column titled "Ghosts Beneath Our Streets," briefly revisiting the Thorn affair. The article mentioned the strange chemical odors, the vanishing ledger, and the rumored connection to H. Holmes, who by then had become a figure of morbid fascination. The writer concluded, if Holmes built his chambers to trap the living, Thorn built his to preserve them in silence. Around this time, a new resident, Mrs. Abigail Kerr, moved into a boarding house opposite the lot. Her recollection, later preserved in an oral history project, describes hearing a faint knocking at regular intervals around midnight. It was not pipes, she said. It came from under the road, always 3 knocks, then a pause. The sound stopped only after a heavy rainstorm which flooded the intersection for several days. When municipal crews came to pump the water, they noted a thin film floating on the surface, oily, translucent, with a faint blue sheen. Samples evaporated before analysis could be completed. The report ended with a practical dismissal, no hazard detected. By winter, street lamps cast their glow across a neighborhood eager to forget. But those who passed the intersection alone claimed the light always dimmed there first, shrinking into a circle of shadow. Within that circle, they said, the air felt warmer just for a heartbeat, before turning sharply cold again like the final breath of someone waiting patiently below. By 1920, Boston entered a new decade of ambition, steel rising, radio crackling, jazz humming through saloons. Yet beneath the noise of progress, the old foundations still whispered. The parcel once marked medical lot, unreclaimed, appeared once more in the city's property rolls, briefly listed as industrial reserve land before being struck out again by hand. Someone, it seemed, kept the record alive long enough for it to breathe before letting it sink back into obscurity. That spring, a trolley maintenance crew attempted to repave the depression at Rutland and Tremont. The foreman, Thomas Harkley, filed a routine work report that later vanished from official archives, but survived in his family papers. His writing was unremarkable until one final paragraph, where his tone shifted sharply. Laid new tar over old surface. Ground vibrated during compression, though no tram passed nearby. Men reported smell of hospital spirits. 2 rats found dead by roller, no marks of injury. Felt warmth through my boots. When he mentioned it casually at a tavern, others laughed it off as exhaustion, but the following week, Harkley fell ill with a fever that turned his skin waxen and cold. His physician noted chemical burns on the soles of his feet. He died within a month, his death certificate reading systemic poisoning of undetermined cause. Meanwhile, an article published in the Boston Medical Quarterly revisited the ethical crises of 19th-century surgery. It referred briefly to a Boston practitioner whose cellar yielded evidence of anatomic transgressions. The piece drew on older notes by Professor Keene and cited a forgotten case file, suggesting that the surgeon had once corresponded with contemporaries in Chicago, possibly including H. Holmes. While the article refrained from sensationalism, it quietly reintroduced Thorne's name into academic conversation. Among readers of that piece was Dr. Nathaniel Corbett, a physician and amateur historian who had long collected curiosities from Boston's past. In July 1920, he petitioned the city for permission to excavate the Rutland site for historical documentation. His request was denied, but weeks later, he claimed to have visited the lot under cover of night. In a private letter to a colleague, Corbett described seeing a faint luminescence seeping through hairline cracks in the asphalt, pale green, like phosphorus on bone. No one believed him. The letter remained in his estate until its discovery in 1974, but it confirmed what oral tradition had kept alive, that the land itself seemed restless, never fully sealed. In late autumn, heavy rains eroded the pavement again, exposing a sliver of the original stone foundation. Workmen filled it quickly, yet one remarked to a reporter that the whole smelled like a hospital drowned in the sea. The paper declined to print the quote, though the journalist kept it penciled in his notebook with a single margin note. Same place, still breathing. As Prohibition took hold and Boston looked toward modernity, few noticed how the street lamps flickered faintly over that corner each night, as if some pulse, buried deep, still matched the rhythm of the living city above. By 1921, the South End had begun to reinvent itself once again, factories turning into lodging houses, Physicians' Row now dotted with tailors and small grocers. Only the triangle of ground at Rutland and Tremont resisted every hand that tried to tame it. City engineers called it structurally unpredictable, though not one could define why. Each new survey produced slightly different measurements, as if the earth beneath were subtly rearranging itself. Early that year, a road crew replacing a gas main unearthed a corroded brass tag no larger than a coin. Stamped across its surface were the letters E.T. the property, and the faint outline of a serpent coiled around a rod, the caduceus, symbol of medicine. The find made its way briefly to the Municipal Museum before disappearing from display without record. When a journalist from the Boston American inquired about it, an anonymous curator replied, "Return to rightful archive," though no one could say where that archive might be. In March, a researcher from the Historical Society, Edwin Lathrop, began compiling a manuscript on unresolved civic legends. He devoted a section to Dr. Edward Thorne, cross-referencing the scarce surviving documents with witness accounts. Lathrop's private notes reveal his fascination with the connection to H. Holmes, whom he described as the shadow against which every medical crime is measured. He argued that Thorne's case was not an imitation, but a regional reflection of the same, an Aziz rationality without restraint. Lathrop spent weeks combing through property files, convinced he could locate Thorne's last written word. He never did, but he found something else. A receipt dated June 1892 for the purchase of embalming compound. 12 flasks, signed not by Thorne but by E.T. Hale, a name strikingly similar to one used later by a Dr. E. Hale, who briefly operated a dispensary in New Haven before vanishing in 1894. The parallel strengthened his theory that Thorne had simply changed his name and continued his work elsewhere. In a letter to a colleague, Lathrop wrote, "It is possible he lived among us still, practicing in silence. The archives whisper of a man moving between states like a ghost in daylight." He planned to present his findings at the Society's autumn lecture series but withdrew, suddenly after claiming his apartment had been broken into. Only papers taken, he noted. No police report was ever filed. He left Boston soon after and was never heard from again. That autumn, paving crews returned to Rutland Street one last time, spreading a final layer of tar to level the intersection. Rain followed within hours, turning the surface slick and black as obsidian. Those who passed by that evening said the new road steamed long after the storm had ceased. When light struck it just so, faint outlines appeared, small oval shapes like the impressions of fingertips pressing gently upward through the asphalt, then fading as the wind cooled the night. The year 1922 arrived with a brittle chill that clung to the streets of Boston like ash. The city was alive with jazz and recovery, yet some corners still carried silence like a wound. The intersection of Rutland and Tremont, that stubborn patch of land, had at last been paved, leveled, and declared stable. For the first time in decades, the city claimed it free of defect. Still, rumors persisted. The trolley operators said their wheels always slipped for half a second when crossing that stretch, as though touching oil or blood. In February, an elderly parishioner from St. Matthias Church, Agnes Merriweather, visited the Historical Society with a curious donation, a small black book bound in cracked leather, wrapped in linen. She claimed it had belonged to her late husband, a carpenter who once worked at the clinic before its closure. The ledger contained only brief notations, measurements, supply orders, and at the back, one sentence written in an immaculate hand. No pulse above, all rhythm below. Archivists could not verify the handwriting, though several compared it favorably to that of Dr. Edward Thorne. The book was filed under restricted access, and its existence was not made public until decades later. During the same month, a young medical intern, Harold Penn, began volunteering at Boston City Hospital. His supervisor noted his unnerving fixation with preservation methods, particularly the early embalming techniques of the 1880s. Penn claimed he had inherited his notes from a forgotten Boston physician. He even referred to the man as my mentor from below. When questioned, he laughed and said it was a private joke about anatomical study. Within weeks, Penn abruptly resigned and left the city. No record of him appears afterward in medical registries. Meanwhile, property files continued to mutate. An auditor's report dated April 1922 lists the Rutland parcel as inactive, no owner, no address. But handwritten beneath that entry, in unfamiliar ink, are the words, "Maintained. Temperature consistent." The line resembles the earlier annotations that archivist Helen Dorr had discovered in 1914, though by now every original record should have been destroyed. The summer heat came, and with it a faint sweetness in the air near the intersection, like flowers mixed with ether. A patrol officer assigned to the south end wrote, "Citizens complain of odor rising from cracks in new pavement. No leak located. Smells medical." The report was filed, then struck through with red pencil. No action required. That autumn, when the city hosted its first medical exposition at Tremont Hall, a short presentation referenced the Thorne phenomenon as an unresolved curiosity in Boston's municipal history. The speaker compared it again, almost ritualistically, to H. Holmes, citing the same convergence of science and secrecy. Yet he concluded with a phrase that unsettled the audience. Holmes built chambers to confine death. Thorne built one to preserve it. When the crowd dispersed into the cool October night, some swore the air near Rutland carried the same faint hum, steady, rhythmic, almost like the heartbeat of a city that refused to forget. By 1923, Boston had all but erased the physical traces of its Victorian past. New electric signage bathed the South End in light, and construction cranes dotted the skyline. Yet the patch of asphalt at Rutland and Tremont persisted, an odd sunken square amid progress. City records again labelled it maintenance yard disused, though no maintenance was ever performed. People simply avoided it. Taxi drivers refused fares that stopped nearby. Even delivery horses balked when guided too close. In March, the Historical Society opened a modest exhibition on lost medical practices of the 19th century. Among the displays were surgical tools typical of the 1880s, rusted clamps, glass jars and worn journals. One cabinet, however, held an object described only as recovered instrument case, origin unknown. Visitors later recalled a smell that lingered near it, sharp, metallic, and cold. No placard mentioned Dr. Edward Thorne, yet rumor spread quickly that the case belonged to him. A letter from curator Charles Denby, grandson of the late archivist Samuel Denby, confirmed that the box had been transferred from municipal storage. "The initials have faded," he wrote, "but I cannot ignore their symmetry, E and T etched like scars through brass." Later that spring, a minor tremor struck Boston, barely perceptible elsewhere but felt keenly in the South End. Newspapers dismissed it as a settling of subway tunnels, but witnesses near Rutland Street described the sound differently. One merchant claimed the pavement breathed, rising and falling twice before stilling again. Another swore the air shimmered as if from heat, though the morning had been cool. That same week, a retired constable named Edgar Cleary, son of the officer who once sealed Thorne's cellar, wrote a letter to the Boston Evening Transcript. His words were measured yet haunted. "I remember my father's voice when he spoke of that cellar. He said the earth there was never truly dead, only waiting. If it stirs again, it is not the work of devils, but of a man who could not let his art end." The newspaper never printed it. The editor's log simply notes, "Submission withdrawn by author before publication." Cleary died later that year of heart failure. Autumn brought heavy rain that flooded Tremont's lower alleys. Residents awoke to find that the newly paved surface at the intersection had cracked clean through the center, forming a fissure nearly a yard wide. Water pooled black and still inside. City workers patched it within a week, but several reported faint shapes beneath the standing water, geometric outlines like tile or perhaps slabs. One worker, when interviewed years later, said softly, "It wasn't stone. It looked like a table." As winter arrived, steam once more rose from the repaired pavement. It came slowly at first, then steadier, pulsing with eerie regularity. Street lamps flickered above, their light beating in time with the mist below. To passers-by it might have seemed a quirk of the weather, but the few who stopped to watch felt something unmistakable, a rhythm too measured, too human, echoing from beneath the ground where a surgeon's work had never ceased. By 1924, the story of Dr. Edward Thorne had become less a matter of record and more a thread of folklore woven through the city's darker memory. Children whispered it in alleys, daring one another to touch the warm patch of pavement on Rutland and Tremont. Grown men laughed at the superstition, but crossed the street all the same, never quite comfortable passing over the place where ground and rumor intertwined. That spring, the Boston Herald published a feature titled Legends Beneath the Cobblestones. Among stories of haunted theaters and forgotten shipyards, a single paragraph mentioned the South End surgeon, describing an unmarked parcel that defies both winter frost and urban design. The writer compared the myth to Chicago's H.H. Holmes, suggesting both tales revealed a nation's unease with progress built on secrecy. The comparison reignited curiosity among local historians, though no one dared petition for excavation. Boston's officials had long since learned that some files were best left unrequested. In April, an electrician named Milo Harcourt was tasked with installing a new streetlight near the intersection. His log entry remains archived in the Public Works ledger. Drove the post through asphalt. Heard hollow echo under the base. 2 strikes later, light dimmed. Returned next morning. Base had shifted overnight, post leaning westward. No sign of tampering. The lamp flickered intermittently for months, its glow weaker than every other along Tremont. Pedestrians called it the surgeon's candle. The name stuck. By midsummer, Boston simmered under relentless heat. One night, residents reported a low, steady hum rising from the street. Not thunder, not machinery, but something slower, deliberate, mechanical in rhythm. The sound lasted nearly an hour, then stopped as abruptly as it began. The next morning, the asphalt near the lamp had softened. A circular imprint pressed inward, as if something beneath had breathed deeply and settled again. The city dispatched inspectors, who cited thermal expansion. They filled the hollow with tar and laid a new surface, stamping the report resolved. But the last line in the field notes carried a peculiar addendum. Written in a different hand, "Surface cools, but heart below remains warm." By autumn, the light still burned weakly, haloed in mist even on clear nights. Passers-by swore the air carried the faintest scent of iodine and roses. A trolley conductor, who made his nightly route along Tremont, later told his granddaughter, "When I looked down through the window, the ground shimmered, like someone was holding a mirror from beneath." Then, as winter descended, the humming returned one final time, softer now, distant, like breath drawn beneath stone. Snow fell and muted everything, blanketing the intersection in perfect stillness. But beneath that calm, warmth persisted. Some said the city itself had absorbed the doctor's will, its pulse synchronized to his endless rhythm, unseen yet perpetual. To this day, the map still bends where Tremont meets Rutland, a subtle misalignment that no planner ever corrects. Locals know the story, though few speak it aloud. They simply step a little faster when crossing that patch, listening, one perhaps unconsciously, for the faint, steady heartbeat of Boston's buried surgeon, still working beneath the floor of time itself.